All right, welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today for our webinar event titled The Future of Data-Driven Accountability in K-12 Education. On this webinar, we're going to discuss the re-release of an important piece of research, our Looking Back to Look Forward report, which helped us look critically at what we do and do not know from the last 20 years of education policy. The work for this report began back in 2021 when our team here at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce Foundation realized we could not answer a pretty simple but very important question to drive the next era of education policy. And that's, after the last 20 years of education reform, what has worked and what hasn't? It was a pretty startling moment for us, considering much of the work of the past 25 years has been focused on improving the quality of data that we have in K-12 education. And we've championed high quality standards, assessment, and accountability, both us as well as our colleagues at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, as tools for educational equity for decades. But we still weren't quite sure what lessons we should carry with us going forward and looking at the future of this field. So we commissioned an ambitious two-part report to answer this question. The first part of that report was a quantitative research review of existing research on federal K-12 education policy since No Child Left Behind. No small task, and it was co-authored by Drs. Dan Goldhaber and Mike DeArmond. And then the second part was a qualitative analysis by Chris Stewart and his team at Brightbeam. The final report was then published in 2023. That report was just one piece of a broader Future of Data in K-12 Education initiative that we launched here at the U.S. Chamber Foundation. It was a multi-year undertaking aimed at examining how data, assessments, and accountability systems can better serve students, educators, and policymakers. And in addition to the report, we launched a design challenge to surface some innovative ideas on how data can be used to strengthen school improvement and accountability. And then we also convened a thoughtful and diverse group of education experts to discuss and provide feedback to all of our efforts. You can find more information about the Future of Data initiative, as well as the design challenge and our working group for that older initiative on our website. Of course, all of what I just said is a little bit different today. The federal education policy landscape is pretty different here in 2026 as we're launching this new year than it was when we originally published this report in 2023. Today, the federal government is focused on expanding school choice programs. It's weighing in on some specific curricular decisions. And of course, the elephant in the room, downsizing the federal education bureaucracy. And all of that leaves critical decisions about the contours of future policy to decision makers, primarily at the state and local level. So to offer some updated context and recommendations on how to meet this unique moment, today we're re-releasing a revised version of that report with relevant data and perspectives. We worked with the report's original co-authors, Dr. Dan Goldhaber and Dr. Michael DeArmond of the Calder Center at the American Institutes for Research to update this work and provide some additional context and recommendations for how the education reform field should approach policy and data as we begin 2026. Our goal in this work has always been pretty simple: to know and spread awareness on the importance of rigorous data analysis in education so that we as a country can better understand which students our schools are serving and those they are not, so we can make smart decisions about supporting the kids who need it most. So before we dive into the conversation, a couple of quick housekeeping items. Today, we're going to start with a conversation with one of the report's co-authors, Dr. Dan Goldhaber of the American Institutes for Research. Dan is the director of the Center for Analysis of Longitudinal Data in Education Research, also known as Calder, at the American Institutes of Research, and he's also the director of the Center for Education Data and Research at the University of Washington. Dan's work focuses on educational productivity and reform at the K-12 level, the teacher workforce, and connections between K-12 experiences and post-secondary outcomes. And then in about 15 minutes, once we've wrapped up the conversation with Dan, we'll welcome in a panel of leaders in the business community who have some experience hands-on engaging with data in K-12 education, and of course have a vested interest in ensuring that the students that leave high school are ready to be successful in work and in life. And then finally, we'll have some time for questions from the audience at the end of this webinar. To submit questions for our panelists, I encourage you to join the conversation on Slido. You can join from the information on your screen below, or by visiting slido.com and entering our event code K-12 education. Again, it's here on your screen. That's slido.com and K-12 education. I encourage you to submit questions throughout, and we'll have plenty of time at the end to discuss. So with that, I am happy to welcome in Dr. Dan Goldhaber to kick us off for a chat about the report. So Dan, thanks so much for being here with us. Excited to kick off this conversation.
Yeah, it's great to be with you, Kyle.
Awesome. Well, so I contextualized this a little bit in my opening, but I want to dive in a little deeper. Let's begin with the context. Why is right now the right time to revisit and update this report? What makes 2026 an important time to consider how data and assessment are being implemented in K-12 education across the country?
It's a great question. Just before I get rolling, I wanted to just shout out to my co-author, Mike DeArmond, to the degree that the report is coherent. It is Mike that gets the credit for it. And in answer to your question, I mean, I think that you did a nice job setting the context, that when we wrote the report, it felt like there was a little bit of a vacuum in terms of federal education policy making. After NCLB, ESSA was passed, and ESSA returned a lot of the discretion over accountability policy and standards back to the states. And so it wasn't quite clear the direction that the federal government was going to take vis-a-vis policy. It's a little clearer now. The federal government under the Big Beautiful Bill is supporting more school choice. There's efforts to try to weigh in on some curricular decisions that are happening in schools. But it still feels like there's a vacuum in terms of accountability policy. And so that was a big focus of the report, because we had focused on NCLB and some of the subsequent reforms and what they meant for accountability and the effects of accountability. The last thing I'll just say before turning it back to you is just that there's still a fair bit of uncertainty, because there's a lot of downsizing at the U.S. Department of Education. So it's not quite clear what the role is going to be of the U.S. Department of Education in terms of either education policymaking beyond some of the things I've already talked about, or education research.
Absolutely. And I know one of our broader goals in revisiting and re-updating this report was to recontextualize and offer some updated recommendations for this new context. I want to dive into that, but of course, first, I think we should talk about the original report's findings. So reviewing all existing and research on the effects of education policy since NCLB is no small charge. Could you tell us a little bit about what you learned in writing the report? Did anything jump out and surprise you?
Well, let me first start with some of the big conclusions, and then I'll come towards some of the surprises. I think, like others, we found that NCLB itself had an impact on math, a positive impact on math achievement as measured by standardized tests. There was far less evidence that it had a positive impact on ELA or reading, but math, the effects were large, especially for younger students. The other thing that is really important, and I think an important lesson for thinking about any kind of accountability policy, is how important it is to measure the contribution of schools and teachers based on the growth in test scores rather than proficiency. So NCLB was built around proficiency, and we learned that there are some real weaknesses of doing that may not be the best way to measure what schools and teachers are contributing to student achievement. NCLB and some of the subsequent policies like, race to the top and teacher evaluation reform, those are kind of national pushes. Not surprisingly, it really matters what state and local policy implementation looks like. So as for instance, there was this big push under Race to the Top for teacher evaluation reform. And the best evidence suggests that the teacher evaluation and compensation reforms that often went along with it didn't really move the needle on student achievement, nationwide, but there are some places where it really did seem to make a difference, and that is consistent with some of the research that has come out over the last 20 years about the importance of teacher human capital and trying to leverage differences in teacher human capital for the benefit of students. So I think that there's a real lesson to be learned there, to not jump to conclusions if you don't see something nationally, to think that it never works. There are cases where it really did work, and maybe it's important to sort of jump into details about why it worked in some places and not others. Two last sort of thoughts. One is that, it's kind of hard to imagine in today's politicized environment, but there was for a very long time a bipartisan commitment around education, policy reform, and really trying to lift up the achievement of, in particular, lift up the achievement of low achieving students. And that seems to be at least less apparent today. One surprise, I think, that maybe shouldn't have been a surprise, but it is, looking back, a surprise, is just the degree to which there was a backlash against accountability and testing in particular. I think that there's a lot of misunderstanding about how much testing was required under the federal NCLB push, but nonetheless, the view is that I think that there was way too much testing, and that has gotten in the way of accountability. So that's another important lesson, and just the strength of that pushback, I think, is a bit of a surprise.
Absolutely. I love the point you made on implementation. It all comes down to how policy goes a long way, but so much of the impact on kids and schools comes down to implementation at the state and local level. And I think that's a place that the business community can play a really key role. So what we touched a little bit on takeaways and recommendations a little in that response, but I wonder if you could tell us a little bit about what are the key takeaways you hope this audience remembers from this work. What are some of the implications for the broader education reform community as they start to think about improving the quality of K-12 schools through policy?
So I think the first takeaway that I want to be super clear about is that schools can make a big difference. I do think that there are folks out there that may think that, where you come into school is kind of your destiny, but we learned that you can move the needle on student achievement. And in fact, when you look at national assessments, I'm thinking of the NAEP tests, which are really the sort of the best metric as to how the country is doing by and large. NAEP scores went up over the course of many decades, including under the NCLB and federal push to reform era. And more recently, the last decade or more, we have seen a real stagnation in NAEP tests, and they really fell off a cliff, at least partially as a consequence of the pandemic. But that need not be the way things are. What schools do can make a difference. I also already said that we need to measure what schools are doing correctly. And so that's looking, I think, at the contribution, the progress that students are making, the growth from year to year in tests, rather than just at proficiency levels. So I think that that's another important takeaway. And I also mentioned, that implementation really matters. And I actually want to call attention to an article that I read recently by Kelsey Piper. It was an article about the achievement of students that were going into UC San Diego, and the achievement in math, and some of the remediation that was needed for those students in math. And it's a striking article because it starts with a really clear example. It says something like, I'm not going to get it quite right, but 2 plus 7 equals what plus 3? right? And so if I'm doing my math right, I think the answer is 6. And it says this is not a trick question. But there are a lot of students that entered UC San Diego with really good grades in math and having, reportedly completed calculus and interested in math, and they couldn't answer that question. And I think it speaks to the need to maintain standards. And I mean that both in terms of sort of the policies that we have for schools, but also just the sort of expectations of what students um, can do and should be doing. Because the other thing that we've learned is that what students do in school, wow, does it matter for their later life prospects. So maintaining standards in K-12 is fundamentally important for maintaining a society where we have productivity growth and where there are good opportunities for students that maybe came into school with, not such a great background in schooling.
Yeah, absolutely. And I know the article you're referring to there about UC San Diego. Striking results here to our team at the U.S. Chamber Foundation too, and want to underscore that it's not just about being successful in life, but it's also about the workplace. Of course,
Yeah.
this is the U.S. Chamber Foundation. Our network is the business community. This is what we hear from employers too. Academic skills absolutely have a role in the workplace, and maintaining standards and ensuring we have quality data on how kids are doing and are using that data to drive improvement is critical for employers in the future of the workforce. I see you want to
Kyle,
jump in. Go ahead.
yeah. I thank you. You actually you spurred a thought, which is, and this is a little self-interested because I'm an education researcher, but like I believe that there is a role for the federal government to continue to try to push for data, transparency, and education research, because we need that to move the country forward. We're in an environment where kids are by and large not doing that well. So I would argue we need that now more than ever.
Yeah, absolutely. I know one of the original findings in the report, or one of the things we touched on in the conclusion of the original report, was around the data environment. Like what can we answer and what can't we? I wonder if you could put a finer point on that. Could you tell us a little bit about what questions we still are unable to answer from the report, and maybe any implications for improving the data and research environment for researchers such as yourself in the education world?
Yeah. So I can't help but answer that question by saying that we have learned a ton about how important human capital is. I said it already, but it's worth repeating. The differences that amongst teachers and their effects in the classroom have been shown to have really, really profound long-term life consequences for students. And that leads you down the route of saying, we need to pay attention to who the teachers are, and we need to pay attention to their development and who gets hired and who doesn't get hired and who is considering entering the teacher pipeline. And I think we know a lot less about those aspects of the education system than we do about how well students are doing when they're in school and who are the teachers once they have been hired. So sort of going back into the pipeline to figure out like, well, why are certain people choosing to pursue a teaching career and other people not? And what's the training that they are getting? And does it look like we're doing a good job building up the human capital of the teacher workforce? All of that fundamentally important and parts of the data system that are often lacking.
Absolutely. I know that I want to dive in and talk a little bit about business community and engagement. And instead of asking you about that, Dan, I want to transition and welcome in our panelists. And we can have a broader conversation, of course, about the report and some of the recommendations and findings, but also about the business community and how the business community can engage in this space. So with that, I will welcome in a couple of other expert voices to this conversation. First, I want to welcome in Dr. Daniel Gran, who is the Director of AI Learning and Research of Ascendient Learning, which is part of Accenture. I know that we have two Dr. Daniel G's now on the screen. So,
Yeah.
for the purposes of clarity, I'm going to refer to you, Dan Goldhaber, as Dan, and Daniel Gran as Daniel for this conversation. Hopefully, we won't have any confusion on that front. And then, second, I want to welcome in Glenn Austin, who is the former director of public policy at the Greater Houston Partnership, also a member of our Business Leads Fellowship program, and he has just founded Austin Legal PLLC. Happy to have you all here. Excited to dive into this conversation. We've got about 30 minutes before I want to open it up to audience Q&A and plenty to discuss. Daniel, I'll first look at you. Could you tell us a little bit about your role at Accenture and why quality data on student performance is critical for you and for the business community?
Sure, absolutely. So at Ascendient Learning, again, part of Accenture LearnVantage, I lead the curriculum development for the external instructor-led training, specifically on data science and AI. So because of that, I am deeply invested in understanding how we assess the quality of curriculum, the quality of the delivery, and make sure that we are putting the best product in front of students. Now, Ascendient and LearnVantage are delivering content to hundreds of thousands, if not millions, of students across 6 continents, still waiting on Antarctica, I believe. And when we have reports like Looking Back Forward, we can very much so learn from the K-12 community and how they're doing assessments so that we can pull it into ours, as well as have confidence in the next round of new hires and employees who will be coming down the pipeline, so that there is an understanding that these students are meeting the quality and capabilities which are really demanded by today's businesses.
Absolutely. Glenn, I have another question for you, but I wonder if you want to jump in on that and tell us a little bit about why data assessment and accountability has been critical to you and the business community down in Texas.
Yeah, well, assessments and accountability data has been really important for us because I think at its core, it provides us situational awareness. It lets us know where gains and losses are happening, what subjects are improving, who's driving those improvements, basically the who, what, when, where, why of what's happening in our schools and how well our students are being prepared. And then once we have that information, we can celebrate and replicate. So we can celebrate the good things that are happening and the teachers and students that are driving those improvements, and just acknowledge their hard work, because it is difficult work to improve. And then we can also replicate those winning models. And so hopefully we can take the findings from the good things that are happening and expand those to new areas and new students, new schools that need them, and kind of bring up the floor there as well. And then at the same time, student learning data also helps us identify problem areas and lets us know where to course correct as quickly as we possibly can. And this is what we saw happen in Houston. We had a chronically underperforming school district that happened to be the largest in the state. And then based on student achievement data, we were able to see which exact schools were underperforming the most. And we were able to take all those underperforming schools, implemented a totally new model, innovative model called the New Education System. And then now, 3 years later, since that school district was taken over by the state, every single subject and every single grade is way up. And so when you think about what we did at Greater Houston Partnership, one of the biggest chambers in Texas, regional chambers, we were always thinking about economic development. And it definitely helped make the Houston region more attractive, and definitely helped us sell the city when we could point to headlines and say, here, look at what the test scores are looking like in the Houston region, and how much better they are today than they were 3 years ago. So very important.
Yeah, absolutely. I love touching on using data about how kids are doing in classrooms in your community today as evidence of a healthy future workforce. I think we hear that from businesses and employers that we talk to all the time. I should say, before we dive into any of the other questions, each of my questions I'll direct at one person, but I welcome the other panelists to jump in with thoughts and comments as we go too. Glenn, you started talking and touched a little bit on the role that transparent data has played in Houston, and a little bit about what you and the Greater Houston Partnership has done to support the district. Could you tell us a little bit about what the business community in Texas and other locations maybe can learn from that experience and should be doing to ensure transparent data about student learning going forward?
Yeah, so I think to give the conclusion first, I'll say proactive and regular engagement of all stakeholders. And that means nonprofits, business leaders, educational institutions, people that can analyze data. Proactive and regular convening was critical for us, but also just paying attention to a few different things. Number one, paying attention to alignment. So how well does K through 12 curriculum and credentials, career pathways, all those things, how do all those things support local labor market needs? Are students graduating ready to work from day one without remediation? That's really important. Another thing is to, as Dan mentioned earlier, to look at growth. It definitely helped us, as I mentioned before, it helped us kind of sell how well Houston is doing educationally when we can look at this growth data, because it speaks to whether or not the floor is being raised and not just are the best getting better. And so when businesses can see that the floor is getting raised, then they'll have greater confidence that the workforce that they're going to rely on is going to be there. And then another big thing for us in Houston was efficiency. And this meant for us, how well are districts spending the money that they have? Very important for businesses to keep tabs on. We wanted to know, are the resources actually getting to the classroom, or are they getting stuck in bureaucracy, or what's happening to them? And we found that when we're going to elected officials, legislators, asking for new resources, asking for investments, we found that legislators are much more willing to offer new investments when they're confident about how the old investments were implemented. And so what businesses can also do is make sure that their school districts are implementing those investments with fidelity. And so, again, just proactive and regular convening of all the stakeholders can make sure that businesses are on top of all those issues.
Absolutely. Love it. I know that we've talked a little bit here about best practices. It's the number one question we get from state and local chambers as we're engaging in everything education and workforce. Who's doing this work well that I can learn from? Dan, I want to turn to you. Could you maybe tell us a little bit about maybe a success story that you know of from the business community supporting transparent data and improving educational outcomes, maybe that was surfaced through this work?
Well, Kyle, just to be clear, we didn't really focus in the report on the role of the business community per se. So you should treat this as more my anecdotal impression. But locally here I'm out in Seattle, and locally here, the Business Roundtable was involved with some of the pushes for reform in the Seattle school district. And I think having that business voice was really important. And I want to come back to something that Glenn was saying. He didn't put it quite this way. So Glenn, correct me if I'm putting words in your mouth, but I think that the business community has a real role to play in influencing local politics, and having businesses come out and say, hey, we need students who come out of high school with, numeracy and literacy skills. It's important to us. It's important for, having a thriving economy and thriving business. That is really, really important. And it's especially important because of what I said about differences in implementation. I think that you can have a policy, you could have a national or state or a local policy, but you can't mandate that policy is well implemented. At some level, it's going to rely on the decisions of local actors, and those local actors and how much they adhere to, make sure that what they are doing is real and substantive and not just for compliance purposes. I think is going to depend a lot on sort of the public accountability that we have from parents and from the business community. So what I've seen is that the business community has a real role to play in that kind of a partnership, and maybe in also direct philanthropic support to make change happen.
Absolutely. Glenn, do you want to jump in and respond to that? I know that Dan was referencing your remarks. I see you nodding your head.
No, Dan was absolutely spot on there. And what we experienced in Houston was it was kind of where we realized that whether we were super actively engaged or took kind of a leading from behind approach, people were going to talk about the business community. Now, whether we're there or not, they're going to say, oh, well, if we do this, then children are going to be better ready for jobs. Or if we do this, then this is going to affect their preparation for the workforce. And so we felt like we had a responsibility to get engaged, because business readiness and workforce readiness was kind of at the core of why we were trying to enact these policies in the first place. So, and then also we have an A through F public school accountability system in Texas, and one of the metrics is college, career, military readiness. And so that career readiness piece almost pulls us into the fight, because if schools are being graded on how well they're preparing students for careers, then we need to be there at the table and confirming whether or not students are really prepared, and making sure that elected officials understand the standards that we would like to see. So super important.
Absolutely. Daniel, I want to turn to you next. You talked a little bit about this in your first remark here, but can you speak to how your focus on workforce upskilling interacts with all these conversations around K-12 education quality? What's the business community asking for you or from you and your team at Ascendient Learning, and how is the business community interacting with that incoming workforce and early career professionals?
Absolutely. And I want to start by going back to something that Kyle said, that the business community is looking for people to graduate ready to work. And while it is absolutely true that the business community relies upon the K through 12 and graduate school college system to really deliver quality students, they also understand that no student is going to be entirely ready to work right off of the bat. And that's the space where we operate. And so what the business community is really looking for, in addition to a core skill set for a software developer, a data scientist, a mechanic, any of these things, is that they would have the ability to learn new skills quickly. And especially in the era of AI, as things are changing so quickly, we need these very human soft skills grounding in the interactions that we have, the community, and ability to bring the best of humanity to their work so that they can adapt to these different systems. Now, for us, we hear a lot from businesses about what they need out of training, and they will come to us again and again and say, here are the skills that we need trained on, but in particular, we're looking for a return on investment. And I think that this is something that particularly policymakers could really learn from. And that if we are looking at businesses and saying, hey, this little week to few months of training needs a return on investment, here we have K through 12, there is such a great opportunity for return on investment. I would imagine that a dollar spent there is far better than a dollar spent on me. And I love my work. Please spend more dollars. But K through 12 is such utter importance. And beyond that return on investment, there's a couple things that our clients are looking for. They're looking for those core concepts that we are training on, things that are equivalent to some of these standardized tests. But they're also looking for capabilities. They want to know that the students can apply what they've learned. And finally, they're looking for a culture change. And I think this is something that both learn, we can share with the K through 12 community, and they can share back. And it can be a great point for interaction, because I know that there is work towards school climate surveys with very mixed feedback one way or another. But when a business talks about a transformation, when we say AI reinvention, we're not just looking for the capabilities of people. We want them to have a mindset shift and think about problems differently. And when I think about particularly high school students, the way that you think coming into middle school or high school should be totally different than the way you think coming out of it. And that's something that I know that ability to adapt and to be resilient are things which the workforce is caring about more and more and more.
Hey, Kyle, can I pick up on something that Daniel said? I want to try to
Please
tie
do.
together a couple of threads. Daniel talked about adaptability and the importance of soft skills. And I think that he's right, that those things, especially in uncertain workforce times, are increasingly important. Those ideas are not inconsistent with measuring schools based on test scores. And what I'm trying to think through is like, or elucidate is that we ought not to think that those ideas are in different directions. I'm tying this back into the testing pushback, because we can see as education researchers that how well kids do in school on tests are highly predictive of their station in life, how much they earn, whether they go to college, whether they're in the labor force. And part of it is probably about what the tests actually measure, the content. Do kids actually know science when they are engaging in science in college? But I also think that what schools are doing is much broader than just teaching kids to do well on tests. They are teaching kids life skills. They're teaching kids to get up and be on time in the morning and study hard. And some of these things that kids are learning in school and at home, they are soft skills. So being diligent is likely to cause you to do better on tests in high school, but it's also likely that you're going to do better when you graduate from high school and you go to college or you go into the workforce or the military. And so we shouldn't think of these measures as in different directions, but we do need to think about how we are assessing schools today. And sometimes we can't always see these sort of long-term, more amorphous soft skills. And we can't sort of wait to see how kids turn out when they get out of high school to assess the high school. So we need some more immediate measures, and maybe some measures that are different than just test scores too. But I just want to emphasize that these things, they are sort of the same direction when we're thinking about the contributions that schools are making.
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, both Dan and Daniel. And I love the kind of through line that you're painting from traditional kind of core academic skills to the skills that employers say they need the most out of the workforce of today and tomorrow. Frequently, we hear from employers the things that they need are critical thinking and the ability to work on a team and communicate ideas to coworkers and colleagues. All of those have fundamentally build off of academic skills, right? I mean, how most of the assessment questions we ask around math and science provide a whole bunch of extra information in a word problem that then a student needs to decipher which pieces are relevant, pull them in, and solve a problem. That's critical thinking and problem solving in a nutshell. And it comes from a lot of how kids learn to do quantitative and mathematical reasoning and learn to read a graph in a science class, etc. Same goes with communication. It's pretty easy to say that a kid who understands how to read and interpret ideas and then communicate them by writing them is probably going to have a much better time doing that in spoken word with coworkers too. And so I think you're totally spot on in drawing that connection between traditional academics and what's needed in the workplace. And appreciate that point, Dan. I think you're spot on.
And chiming in, one of the areas where I'm really excited for K through 12, as well as the college environment, is more and more access to information. Every day, my daughter logs into Khan Academy and learns math. And she is far ahead of her grade level because she loves it and she's excited about it. And the reason why people choose access to systems like Khan Academy or Udacity, a partner of ours, is that they're looking for that quick knowledge for an individual to apply it to a task. And when we bring in instructors into a room, the real advantage comes in the communication and the community and the ability for one student to answer the question of another. And as we see more personalization, more integration of AI in ways that don't supplant the teacher, but rather augment, I would love to see how we could measure the dynamics of the classroom and how they are helping the students to develop these school skills which will be needed for the next generation. And I know that's prognostication and wishes, but I'm excited and not too scared about the integration of AI into our classrooms.
Yeah, absolutely. I see we already have a question in Slido about AI and its implications. I want to make sure that we get to audience Q&A, but before we do, I want to shift this panel conversation a little bit to talk about some recommendations and takeaways. So, Dan, I'll turn to you first, and then Glenn and Daniel, I'd love for you to jump in here too. What would you like to see from policymakers and the education reform community, given all that you've learned through this research? Is there any momentum for changes and maybe some high-level recommendations and things that we should be keeping in mind, Dan?
So we covered some of it earlier on, and I don't want to be too repetitive, but like maintaining standards, thinking about measuring schools, transparency. I think that those are all really important ideas. I think that given the concerns and the politics around testing and accountability, that we need to think about ways of maintaining standards and accountability, but do it more efficiently. So I think that it's important to continue to push on, new ways of testing, new ways of doing assessment. And so I would say that those there are all really important, but like at a more basic level, I think we are still operating a bit in a vacuum, and I'm not sure that people understand how the achievement levels that we are seeing in education today, what those mean for our future, and the level of concern that we ought to have about them. So I just hope for more engagement among stakeholders across the board, definitely including the business community, around how we improve schooling and education for students.
Glenn, Daniel, do you want to jump in? Anything you'd add here?
Sure. I would say that there is definitely concern from businesses around the incoming or an upcoming workforce, around things like great inflation, the COVID-19 pandemic and how that affected students, and artificial intelligence. And I would say that there are two pathways which can be taken. There is the sunk cost fallacy, where we can just keep doing the same thing because it's what we've done and we want to avoid changing it. And then there is throwing the baby out with the bathwater. I don't know what fallacy that is, but unfortunately, I see that both of these things are happening. We oftentimes want to say, no, this is the way it's done. This is the tradition. These are the standards. We're going to stick to them. And people who will say, it's all bad, let's just throw it all out. The signals which we are receiving as the business community matter. And the signals that we want to see is a concerted effort for improvement. We don't want to see things thrown out. We don't want to see things remain exactly the same. We want to see thoughtful, engaged, data-driven improvements, even to the data-driven assessments themselves.
Yeah, and I'll just kind of close out here with two things. First, middle school. So we have lots of data on the front end of education, early childhood education, pre-K, and also at the back end when kids are in high school getting ready to graduate. But let's not forget about middle school. Middle school is really important because we don't want to lose what we've invested in the early years. We want to make sure that they have that carrying through to the older years when they're getting ready to graduate. So paying attention to middle school is important. And then also testing. I just think on a broad level, it's important that we do not just reject the idea of testing. Testing is important. Doesn't mean that all tests are perfect. Tests are when you talk about social and emotional learning, tests may not be the best at measuring that, but what they can measure is academic inputs. And so they can absolutely tell us whether someone is on grade level with reading, math, science, history, those things. And we also shouldn't be afraid to subject our young students to testing. You know, testing is a part of life. We shouldn't be afraid of testing. We take driver's tests to get our driver's license. We take the SATs and ACTs to get into college. We take the ASVAB to get into military. So testing, it shouldn't be this scary thing where we're risking injuring our young students by subjecting them to tests. No, we should not be afraid of testing. And so as long as we're making it better, and as long as we're making efforts towards having those tests measure what we're looking to inspect, then we should support testing.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's a key point there, Glenn. You started to close us out there, Glenn, but I'll tee you up. Maybe Glenn and then Daniel. I'd love if you could chime in from the employer perspective here too. Glenn, from the perspective of chambers of commerce, who are listening to this discussion, who may not be as familiar with these conversations, data assessment and accountability as you and the Greater Houston Partnership are. What are some of the topics that you suggest they pay attention to and convene some experts in the community on? And then Daniel, same for employers. For employers listening, how should they think about these topics and how can they engage?
Yeah, so I think the main thing, as we mentioned before, is making sure there's that return on investment. I think that's a language that business owners speak every single day, is if I put this in, what am I getting out? And so I think that's probably the biggest factor and the thing that business leaders can best understand. And again, just proactively and regularly convening experts and stakeholders on the front end. You know, no one wants to get brought in at the end of a conversation to see if there's consensus. So bringing stakeholders in, again, proactively and regularly on the front end is critical.
And I would add to that, first echoing that middle schoolers are so important. They have they're headed into high school. They have that level of intelligence to engage deeply, but they have almost no social awareness and are just ready to do everything goofy. I would say to the business community, don't just push policy. That there's an element of that. And don't just look at the data, look at the ways in which students are failing and, either throw up your hands in defeat and say, we're going all in on AI. We're not hiring new grads, but rather to engage with schools at the local level and put your people in those schools. Help volunteer, invest time, invest money, because many of the students are looking at the state of the economy and of AI today and saying, I don't know what my future will look like. There are people saying that in retirement investments will be obsolete in a few years. But if those students can see the different opportunities in the workforce, whether that is someone who is filing papers with the county, whether it's someone who is working at a gas station, like all of these different opportunities and all of these different careers are things that kids want to see. They want to know what's available, and only the businesses have the ability to really make that happen at scale.
Yeah, I think the through line through both of your responses there, Glenn and Daniel, is the importance of partnership. It takes a village to train and make sure that the kids are receiving the learning and building the skills that they need to be successful in work and in life. And I think we want to make sure that the business community and education community, et cetera, all feel like it's not just on them, and that all of the different stakeholders and communities in state houses here in DC and in the federal landscape all are sitting around the right table with a unified vision of where we're trying to go. And what that looks like is making sure that all kids have the skills and training that they need to succeed, right? Absolutely. Awesome. Well, again, I want to transition to talking with our panelists now from you all in our audience. A reminder, that if you want to submit some questions, we have a couple already, but you can submit questions and join the conversation on Slido. You can join from the information that's here on your screen, scan the QR code, or you can join us at slido.com and entering the event code, which is K-12 education. One of the top questions that came in during our conversation was around the importance of communication. A lot of we spoke a little bit about the different perceptions of assessment and accountability, what it means, how it feels for the communities who are being measured and told they're either doing well or not. And a lot of that comes down to how we communicate why we are doing assessments and how those assessment results are being used. So, Dan, maybe I'll look at you first, and then Glenn and Daniel, I welcome you to jump in. How can we improve communications about how students are doing and how those results are used to drive improvement?
Well, I in some ways, I'm the wrong person to ask about communication, but I will say the reason I keep coming back to this issue of tests is because I hear when I'm presenting, research, oftentimes people from the audience say, well, we know that tests don't really matter. And so on one level, I think that it is important to communicate that, tests do matter. How much kids learn in school matters. So it's not the tests themselves, right? It's what the tests represent, is that they are hopefully a good measure of what kids have actually internalized and learned content-wise in school. So I think that it's really important to stress that we don't care about the measure for the measure's sake. We care about it because it is indicative of how well kids are likely to do when they leave school. And we need some way to know whether our public institutions, our schools, are doing a good job, because we need to know if the investments, this goes back to, Glenn's point about return on investment. We need to know if the investments that the schools are making are the right investments. So I think that is very hard. All of that is hard to communicate because there are a lot of different adult interests at stake, and sometimes the adult interests are at odds with holding schools kind of accountable and being transparent about achievement. But really, really important that we do that.
Yeah. Glenn, Daniel, jump in here. Any thoughts on how we can improve the communication of assessments, their purpose, why we do them, and why they're important?
I'd say that two examples come to mind. The first is Domino's. About half a decade, 10 years ago, they had a whole campaign. Hey, our recipe was bad. We have a new recipe. That's a big transformation for an old chain to just throw away a recipe and come up with a new one. And they communicated that really well, that they were transforming something based on the feedback that they had received. It was data driven. And I think that you can go into a bit more depth with schools, but you can tie changes that are being made to the data that you have. And that way, the changes to the schools won't seem arbitrary, but will be able to be grounded in something and thereby raise the value of those tests because changes were tied to them. And then the other thing is the census. Every 10 years, we get flooded with advertisements about how important the census is. I very much think a public campaign of awareness, not to everyone, but maybe within schools, talking about how important this is, sharing infographics, which everybody loves an infographic, at least in the data science world, would just be wonderful to communicate to people. We have so many tools in the data science and data analysis world that we could absolutely port into this communication to ensure that parents and educators and school district members would have an awareness of why these tests matter and what you can do with them.
Yeah. I like you referencing dominoes and that campaign that I'm remembering now, because it's similar to kind of the setup of this report. What do we know? What don't we know? And let's be honest about both of those answers, so that we can, better hopefully address the things that we have not done as well and improve them for the future. Glenn, I wonder if you could jump in here, maybe with some of your lived experience from communicating around assessment and accountability in Houston.
Yeah, how can I top a Domino's reference? But I'll give it a shot. Um, so I think first of all, it's important for businesses to just be on the playing field. There's going to be, to be frank, lots of opposition to strong testing and accountability, and businesses just have to be prepared for that. But you got to be on the playing field. And what we saw happen in Houston was, so we had the state intervention come because the district was chronically underperforming. And it was interesting how the opposition's narrative would shift over time. At first, they said, it's not going to work. The scores are not going to improve. And so then when the scores improved, it was, oh, well, yeah, these scores improved, but these are gains from what the last superintendent was doing. And so the new one is just kind of riding on the coattails of the old one. And then it became, and then when the gains were, the gains stayed, it was, oh, well, the gains are not going to be sustained over a long period of time. Like, yeah, this was just a flash in the pan, but these gains will not be sustained. And so now here we are 3 years later, and the scores are all through the roof. Again, like I said, in every subject, in every grade. And now the narrative for the opposition has shifted to, yeah, well, what about social and emotional learning, which is something that's not even measured by the test is not intended to measure those things. And so now we're completely off the scale. And so but the whole time, as Daniel mentioned, business has been putting forth a data-driven approach to the communications. And so, like you said, it makes it to where the things that we've requested and the things that we're talking about are not arbitrary. It's, data is driving these decisions. And we also have the data to back up that these new policies and things that we're implementing are being successful. So just stay on the playing field. Don't expect some choppy waters here and there, but it's important just to stay the course and stay data driven.
Yeah. Consistency and commitment and approach, right, Glenn?
That's right.
Awesome. Okay, one question that I'll ask, and anyone feel free to jump in here, is around technology in the classroom. This person in our audience has noted when they look at classrooms today, everyone seems to be on tablets and laptops. What's the impact on learning of technology? And I'll throw in social media and cell phones, since that's often a very common topic here in the ed world these days. How should we think about technology, including social media and cell phones, impact on student learning? And maybe are there any implications for how we measure school quality and academic learning in that environment?
I mean, I'll jump in with what we know about, which is not a ton. I think that there's broadly some pretty good evidence that, social media, cell phones, early introduction in a child's life to those, probably not good for kids. There's a very good study by Figlio and David Figlio and Umut Ozek about a cell phone ban in one of the districts in Florida that suggests some positive benefits for students. Those are some of the ways that we tend to think about technology in schools, but of course, technology in schools is much broader than just cell phones. Kids are in a lot of schools, they're on tablets for much or all of the day. And I think that there is growing concern that might not be great, but technology can be used in productive ways too. And I think that we shouldn't sort of all become Luddites and say which schools shouldn't use technology. It'd be crazy to think that we don't use technology to sort of tailor instruction and help to make routine tasks for teachers easier so that they can devote more time to student learning. And so, it's a big topic, and I think we really need to hone in on what is the nature of the technology use and sort of think about different categories where, students' use of technology in different ways, from anything from distraction to, Daniel's example of Khan Academy, those are very different uses of technology. So I wouldn't want to generalize here. I think we need to dig into the specific use and figure out what are effective ways to use technology.
Absolutely. I see we're right at time, but Daniel, I know that you'll have a thought here. Do you want to jump in and talk really briefly about technology in schools?
Yeah, absolutely. I would say that the Luddites weren't inherently against technology. They wanted everyone to benefit from it. And every student should be able to benefit from technology. Now, I don't believe that we need a screen-mediated learning experience inside of schools. We need the students to engage face-to-face. And we should absolutely see that the technology is used to facilitate learning, but it is never the focus of the learning. We very much want those connections, because at the end of the day, the skills that people have with technology are going to change. The things that we need them to do and learn are going to change, but the ability to interact with another human is not going away.
Yeah.
Absolutely. I think that's the perfect final point there. Well, I want to say again, thank you so much to all three of our panelists for joining us today. I think this has been a really rich conversation around a whole bunch of topics in K-12 education. For those of you listening to this call, I obviously highly encourage you go and check out the report, complete with some updated recommendations and context for the current moment. Please, of course, feel free to share the report with your networks. We'll also have a recording from this event available that you're welcome to go and look back at and share with your colleagues. And be on the lookout for more from us at the U.S. Chamber Foundation on this topic. We're planning to publish a series of issue briefs on topics within data assessment and accountability in K-12 education throughout 2026. This is a launching point of more, and our first topic for that issue brief series is going to be focused on the honesty gap and communication about student performance. Look out for that in either February or March of this year. Finally, if you want some more information about the U.S. Chamber of Commerce's Foundation's work on this area or anything in education and workforce, please don't feel to reach out and contact us at education@uschamber.com. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us here today. Thanks to our panelists for a really rich conversation, and for the audience for your attention. Thanks, everyone, and have a great rest of your day.